Good morning, everyone, and I hope you're all keeping well out there. Looks like we're setting up for a bit of a heat wave the next few days, but we'll make it through. Give those crops a bit of good sunshine, and another week, hopefully some more rain, and all will go well. Anywho, last week I skirted around Father's Day because the gospel passage was one of those, if you love father and mother more than me, you're not worthy of me, Jesus saying that. And then the Old Testament reading was from the stories of Abraham, where he sends, if you're familiar, his first son is actually by one of his wives, one of Sarah's servants, Hagar. And the son was Ishmael. Last week's story was Abraham sending Hagar and Ishmael off into the wilderness because Sarah was jealous of them. Because Sarah was still, Isaac was born by then. But she thought that Ishmael was making fun of Isaac. Anyway, Abraham sends them out into the desert with literally only a bag of water, a water bag, and maybe a little bit of food. And it was basically you got about a day's worth of supplies here. Not a very good thing for a father to do. Anyway, and so I didn't get into that passage last week. And this week, the story of Abraham, God telling Abraham to take Isaac and go to Mount Moriah and sacrifice him is the Old Testament passage. I figured I could get a little more content out of it than what was the New Testament passage. So we're going to have a look at the Abraham and Isaac story quite a bit this morning. And I got to warn you, it's not really going to be an easy sermon. Looking at Genesis chapter 22, verses 1 to 14. After these things, after sending Hagar and Ishmael out into the wilderness, after these things, God tested Abraham. He said to him, Abraham. And Abraham said, Here I am. God said, Take your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains that I shall show you. So Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him, and his son Isaac. He cut the wood for the burnt offering, and set out and went to the place in the distance that God had shown him. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place far away. Then Abraham said to his young men, Stay here with the donkey. The boy and I will go over there. We will worship, and then we will come back to you. Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife. So the 2 of them walked on together, and Isaac said to his father Abraham, Father. And he said to him, Here I am, my son. And Isaac said, The fire and the wood are here, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering? Abraham said, God himself will provide the lamb for a burnt offering, my son. So the 2 of them walked on together. When they came to the place that God had shown him, Abraham built an altar there and laid the wood in order. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then Abraham reached out his hand and took the knife to kill his son. But the angel of the Lord came to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, Here I am. He said, Do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. And Abraham looked up and saw a ram caught in a thicket by its horns. Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called that place, The Lord Will Provide. As it is said to this day, on the mount of the Lord it shall be provided. The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Sorry, that's a difficult one to read. Last Sunday was Father's Day, and that usually invites some interesting posts on social media, particularly on the religious side of things. Take this one, for example. It showed up on my Facebook page. It's from a poster that just simply calls himself, herself, God is not real. And it reads, I'm bothered when religious people make claims about God taking sides in a war or favoring any specific country. If God were a loving father, as he's alleged to be by his followers, then he would prevent wars from happening in the first place. Can you imagine a human father with a son and a daughter brutally fighting each other over some trivial matter, like property or political discourse? And their father knows about it and allows it to happen, or worse yet, aids one sibling in the destruction of the other. That would be absurd. And we'd say of that father that he's a horrible parent. That's why I wrote in a 2013 essay that we know for a fact from listing qualities of a loving father that God most certainly isn't one. The post bothered me for not the obvious reasons, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time arguing this one down because it would just begin to sound like two fifth graders in a contest to see who can stand the furthest from the urinal and still hit it. That may be fun for the boys involved, but who wins that kind of a contest pales in comparison to the mess that's left behind. Just ask the custodian, the teacher, or the parent who has to clean that up. Back in the day, you would have made the kids who were responsible for it clean it up. But today, if that happened in a school, can't imagine the lawsuit that loving parents would wage against a school system should it make the children responsible clean that kind of a mess up. I have to ask, should God be any different with the horrible, horrible, horrible messes that we humans create by doing things that God has for millennia said don't do? And by that question, should we expect God to make it so we clean our own messes up and learn from them? I will say this to those standing on the other side of this argument, that it's problematic to reduce biblical faith to a matter of beliefs versus facts, or God says and science says this and science says that. That's part of the methodology behind the post. The point of what is behind the Bible and the story that it tells is that it's a story of the fidelity of God to a people and the fidelity of that people to the God. It is about fidelity between two parties, a relationship. And we really shouldn't reduce the story down to who has the right beliefs and the most accurate facts. That's not what's at the heart of the biblical story. That's not really the lesson there. It's also not a rule book that says this is what God expects of us, do it or else. There is that there involved, but it's more about fidelity within a relationship. I would also warn against being what's called anachronistic, which is, judging the past by the standards of the present. And this would involve judging the moral standards and values of the past culture of the Bible by the moral and standards of our present culture. What a Western Gen Xer or millennial calls a loving father should not be used to judge what we define as a biblical definition of fatherhood. Now, there's a couple thousand years between those two definitions, and they are very different cultures. The task for us is to know what they did and why they did it. Looking at the book of Leviticus and, the law against eating seafood, eating crabs, it's kind of ridiculous, but we need to understand, what they did and why they did it. I'm not sure anyone's cracked the code on that yet, but they have on the eating pork thing. That said, we shouldn't read our present standards back onto the Bible and judge it. So also we should neither ignore the lessons that we've learned over the past couple thousand years. Both these times and cultures, biblical culture and modern culture, modern Western culture, would agree that fathers should discipline their children. And that doing so is part of what it is to love your children. But, that whole sparing the rod, the literal rod thing, that comes from a time when children were regarded as little more than livestock. And, how literal do you want to be about this? How many of us could take a wooden stick and beat a child? I couldn't. I don't think anybody I know here could. We know now that there are better ways to correct a child than traumatizing them with physical abuse. Maybe we should let that spare the rod stuff stay in the past and pursue better avenues to disciplining our child. I think the point there is discipline your children. And anyway, I'd also like to say that I'm a bit sympathetic with what the person who put the post up on Facebook is saying. Political leaders and religious communities should not be running around claiming God is on our side. If God is on the side of anybody in a war, it's on the side of those who are seeking to love, feed, and house the enemy. The side of the children who are being scarred for life by the bombs and the bullets. The side of those who are having to suffer the horrors of war. Even if it's the soldiers. Why doesn't God prevent war? I don't know. That's a very good question. I would like to know that too. I'll offer an answer. One answer that comes up is that love involves giving the one you love free will, which involves the harsh reality of having to eventually let the people you love make their own mistakes. Loving fathers and mothers will from time to time let their children suffer the consequences of not doing what they have told their children time and time again not to do, or should I say, of doing the things that their parents have told them not to do. I had a double negative in there, it didn't work. And I think letting your children suffer the consequences, this is especially true when it comes to matters involving addiction. So it is with war. War is very much rooted in addiction. Revenge addiction, power addiction, wealth addiction, and usually narcissism. The revenge addiction, power addiction, wealth addiction, and narcissism of certain powerful individuals at the top of the food chain, so to speak. Their addiction is what brings about war. They are the ones who tell the lies that delude the masses, who unfortunately buy into the stinking thinking of wanting to rule the world. Unfortunately, God is on our side is one of those lies. The only way humanity is going to learn that war is not an option is to suffer the consequences of it. Unfortunately, we keep repeating the same mistakes over and over and over again, and the only lesson we seem to be learning is how to do war with bigger and more effective means. What's it going to take to get us over war? Maybe it's deal with the addictions. Well, anyway, looking at the loving father stuff, if you're interested, the best definition of what the Bible would call fatherhood, of what it is to be a father, and the one is one that I found in a book. Excuse me, my prompter is getting away from me. Anyway, there we go. The biblical definition of fatherhood, the best definition that I've found for that is in a book written by a woman. She's trying to offer a reason as to why we call God the Father. The book was written by a woman, Mary Ann May Thompson. That's spelled with a P. Some of you Thompsons from Chesley are wondering, you might be related. She looked at a couple of Old Testament examples of fathers, particularly Abraham and Job, and she tried to garner from what we have from the stories of their lives an understanding of what Jesus may have meant by calling God the Father. What in the Bible did they mean by the idea of father? She gave a list of things that a father does. A father brings a family into existence, of course, provides for his children, provides his children with an inheritance, protects them. Father is a figurehead of authority in the family to whom obedience and honor are properly rendered. And I would add to her list, a father disciplines or rears rightly his children. A father himself has faith, and a father rears his children within the context of faith. It's an important task of fatherhood in the Bible. If a father fell short of his responsibilities as a father, he would be seen as dishonorable in the eyes of the broader community. The standard back then was not whether or not you were a loving father. It was whether or not you were an honorable father, whether or not you performed those responsibilities in an honorable and a good way. Oddly, things like affection and attending to the emotional development of your child and helping them to pursue their dreams would have been absolutely foreign ideas to a father, to a mother, to family back then. Now, with respect to the responsibility of a child in a family, the greatest responsibilities of being a child back then were to honor and obey the father, mother too, mostly the father, and serve the needs of the family. You were part of this family and you had to do what's best for the family. And also, and this is one in particular, that steward the family inheritance faithfully. You were to participate in what the family business was. What was the coming in that the father would be able to pass on to the children? You had to do your part to make that happen. Now, this be all you can be, the world's your oyster, child-centered, go-to-therapy world we live in would have been utterly foreign to them. And I would add also to our own culture just 100 years ago. And that might make us want to ask if our ideas of loving fatherhood and pandering to individualism might actually be an aberration. that we as a culture need to put a check on. It's pretty well dictating our school systems, and basically all we're winding up with is children addicted to devices sitting on couches while the adults in the room go about destroying the planet. Anyway, having said all that, let's play a game called Let's Not Jump to Conclusions. We just read together the story of God commanding Abraham to take his son Isaac, the child of the promise, on a 3 days journey to Mount Moriah, which would later become the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. And there on Mount Moriah, offer Isaac as a burnt offering. Abraham does it. He sets out. He even made Isaac carry the wood. And he lied to Isaac and the men with him profusely the whole way about what was going to happen, that God would provide the sacrifice. Abraham didn't know that. I think he kind of guessed that would be the outcome, Abraham knowing who God was. Abraham himself, he couldn't believe God would have him do such a thing. But anyway, he followed through, right up to the point of raising the knife to bring it down to kill Isaac. And an angel stopped him. And then suddenly there's a ram in the thicket. I hear this story and I'm appalled. The trauma that Isaac must have suffered. Abraham too. He loved his son, which is something uncharacteristic of a father in his days. What kind of a God would demand such a thing? What kind of a loving father would follow through on it? It would be very easy to dismiss this God and this faith on the basis of this atrocious treatment of a child. But I've learned in life not to throw the baby out with the bathwater. I've learned rather to dig a little deeper when it comes to these things, because God is a difficult God who gets his hands dirty in our difficult, dirty lives. See, the nations around Abraham back then practiced child sacrifice. It was not uncommon for a father who sought to be a great and powerful leader of a great nation, or just a tribe, to sacrifice his firstborn son to the Canaanite, Phoenician, Moabite god known as Molech. They'd sacrifice their firstborn, believing that, by sacrificing their heritage, their namesake, that this God will make them great. If this passage says anything, it's that Israel, by command of its God, will not sacrifice children as did the surrounding nations. But even so, as the centuries went on, the kings and oligarchs of Israel and Judah, in like manner to today's presidents and billionaires among that thing called the Epstein class, the kings and oligarchs of Israel and Judah began to sacrifice their children to Molech, believing that sacrificing their firstborn would make them powerful and all the more wealthy. Guess what God did? When they began to do that, first in the northern kingdom of Israel is divided into two parts then, Israel and Judah. In the northern kingdom of Israel, when the powerful and the rich began to sacrifice their children, God sent the Assyrians and leveled their cities and carried away everybody who was anybody, most of the people, away into exile. That was in 701. And then in 586, after the kings and the powerful people of Judah there in Jerusalem started to do this with their own children, sacrificing them to Moloch, God sent the Babylonians in to rout them and carry them off the land completely into exile as a humiliated nation. No longer were they great, they were humiliated and no longer had a land. God even let the Babylonians destroy his temple. He didn't want to be associated with that. The sacrificing of children for power and wealth would not and will not be tolerated by God among God's people then nor now, for God is on the side of the children. Atrocious things do happen to children still today. In the pursuit of their own wants and desires, adults inevitably sacrifice their own children. They don't throw them on an altar and knife them to death, but might as well. We are not remiss to ask God why he allows it. And I myself, I certainly have my questions as to why God let things happen to me in my childhood that scarred me. In response to that, I could have gone the route of revenge and prayed God to get them, or found some way for myself of getting back at them. But revenge is not the route. Revenge becomes an addiction. Grudging is an addiction before which we will become powerless, and it will change who we are. If I chose the route of revenge, I might have felt as if I had gotten even with the person and might have gotten slight joy out of that. I don't know. But the law of generational trauma dictates that I would only wind up sacrificing my children just as I was sacrificed. The route I chose was to do everything I could not to do unto others as was done unto me, and more so to seek to forgive those who had hurt me. Something which took God's help to do, and which God showed up for and led me to do. I'll close by saying, let's not judge the stories of the Bible, or the God of the Bible, at face value. Those stories are multifaceted and meant to be mined deeply. And also, let us not be so shallow as to say it's God's rule book meant to be followed or else. Let us not say my God is better than your God or any of that sort of stuff. Let's just remember that just about everybody around us has suffered some sort of childhood trauma to varying degrees. Tread lightly. Don't make it any worse. Amen. Going to leave you with a nice old hymn. Words are kind of difficult at times. They're kind of archaic, I guess. It's Come Ye Disconsolate. And you folks have a good week. And God bless you. Amen. Come ye disconsolate, where ye languish, come to the mercy seat fervently kneel. joy of the desolate, light of the straying, hope of the penitent, faithless and pure. Here speaks the Comforter, tenderly saying, earth has no sorrow that heaven cannot cure. Here see the bread of life,